Welcome back to another episode of the HIT podcast. My name is James Layton, CEO and founder of Anderson James. This is the podcast where I bring you real life stories from some of the most interesting leaders of our sector. Today, I was delighted to be joined by Ceri Theobald, Director of Strategic Partnerships at Futures Housing. We talk at length about the impact of the pandemic, how Futures and Ceri have implemented flexible and agile working, and things that Ceri's done to improve his mental health through the lockdowns and the pandemic. We also talk about development and Ceri's predictions for the future of housing. If you do enjoy the episode, I'd ask that you like and subscribe so we can reach as many people as possible. Ceri, welcome to the podcast.
Good afternoon. Thank you, James. It's a nice welcome respite from most of the other bits and pieces I've been doing all today. So looking forward to today.
Nice. Like I always do, and traditionally, I just ask all of our guests to just give us an introduction to themselves. I've obviously done an introduction in the pre-notes, never quite do it justice, but just for the listeners, could you just give us an introduction to yourself, Ceri?
Yeah, hi. So I'm currently with Futures Housing Group, based in the East Midlands. I'm the Director of Strategic Growth and Partnerships there. What does that cover? Because it doesn't really describe it very well in the title. So it's got development, comms, PR, sustainability, partnerships and growth. So kind of quite a bit of the external facing pieces and of the organisation. Been there since September last year. So joined during the pandemic. Prior to that, I was with Flagship Housing. But I've only really been in the housing association sector for around 10 years. My formative parts of my life were in private sector, working with companies like HomeServe and Kia and a company called May Gurney. So a varied experience of the past.
Lovely. And I've known you for some time, and I remember May Gurney and Kia, that takes me back quite a long time. But in terms of your role then, I mean, I've not seen many roles with that much responsibility. So like, where's the focus of the role, and what do you spend most of your time doing in that opportunity?
Development is obviously a big area of what we do. It's a key driver for the organisation in terms of the delivery of the new homes. But undoubtedly, sustainability over the last 12 to 18 months is becoming probably one of the single biggest challenges we've got as a sector. So I'm spending an awful lot of time over that. Prior to my appointment, sustainability wasn't part of any of the executive portfolio, so we've really had to fashion that bit. So I think those are probably the two areas, alongside the kind of the growth and the partnerships piece. And that partnerships piece actually that's not just about development, that's across the whole organisation, about how we integrate with our communities. So those are probably the three key areas, I suppose, that I spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, and just for the benefit of the listeners, I obviously know some of this, but just give us a helicopter view of Futures. How many properties are they, and sort of what the development plans are for the business in the future? So
we've got around 10,000 homes, conveniently located at either end of the country, pretty much. So we had a stock transfer in Northampton or Daventry, and then we've got a whole load around the Amber Valley, which is where our local our LSVT transfers were, and then we've got a proliferation of properties between those two places, largely along the M1 corridor, really. So it's difficult, but we've got an operating model that works in those two areas. In terms of delivery of homes, we're looking at delivering somewhere between 250 and 300 homes a year. And we've got a development pipeline that's looking to deliver that. Obviously, the pandemic has put some pay to some of those challenges those targets over the last couple of years. But that's certainly our aspiration anyway.
Yeah, and in development, that's interesting. So the stock's quite dispersed in terms of the locations. How do you devise a strategy on development when there could be development in any parts, I suppose, of that patch?
We clearly focus around those key areas where we've got local authority partnerships. So what is now the West North Hants in terms of the new unitary and the Amber Valley. But we're obviously working between those two areas to build up relationships with the local authorities in that geography so that we can essentially bridge the gap. And our strategy is largely around that, and where our operating model, where we can support our customers from those two bases really in between.
Yeah, and on the development front, what's been the big challenge for you since you've come into the role? Like, obviously, the pandemic's one big bit, and I know we're going to talk about that at length, but what other things are you seeing as a big challenge at the moment in development?
I'm sure that, if you just read the media in terms of, materials and labour and, I guess, competitiveness and land, it is a really difficult environment to be in. From my perspective, I think one of the key things outside of that I've tried to do coming into Futures is to create a culture in our team, which is a lot more collaborative. I've long held the belief that client-contractor relationships are broken just by their very construct, and that partnership where we both understand what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to get out of it, and being really transparent and open about that. Because I just think, outside of those bits, and you were just working down the contractual piece, you're just destined to failure. So, so for me, the big challenge is trying to get an environment where people are prepared to be open, transparent, authentic, and honest. Not think that they're going to win every argument, but it's about what's the best outcome here. And I think in the difficult environment that we find ourselves at the moment, I think our developer partners and people that are kind of identifying land and putting homes in the ground, they need our support. But equally, we've got to continue to deliver homes for the people that we serve, and we need real transparency to be able to do that. So again, we want false promises telling me you're going to deliver something now and we don't get it for 12 months. So just be open and honest.
Yeah, I remember my background, as you know, was in maintenance, and they worked really hard on that relationship over the years, and I feel like it was broken and it's getting better, and there's much more JV partnership stuff now in that world. But I think there's a long way to go in new build housing, because I think it's a difficult concept anyway, isn't it? And obviously, I think if you put quality at the heart and the customer at the heart of that development program, that's the key way to do it. But obviously, financials, costs, things always come into the way of that, don't they? So it's how do you create partnerships at Futures that inspire people to want to work and inspire contractors to want to work with you?
I think the interesting thing for me is when you have kind of quasi public sector with private sector, you've got very different motivations. And I think there's sometimes a lack of understanding what the motivations are. You only ever see it through your own lens. Yeah. And what we all need is a bit of a paradigm shift, because when I think you can understand and look through the lens of the people that are the other side of the table from you, mm-hmm. you can start to understand their motivations. And I think that creates a very different conversation. For a long time, in my last role, I was probably solely looking at local authority relationships. And for a long time, I thought I really understood that, until such time as I seconded myself into a local authority to shape up a JV. And when you really start to get under the skin of it, I had no clue. If you look at local authorities and the breadth of the portfolios and the responsibilities that people have and the challenges they've got on a day-to-day basis, only that level of understanding really truly allowed me to be able to shape what the solution to that problem could be. Right. And I don't think we invest in that. We're all looking at what do we get out of it? Let's get quick results, and we don't put enough time into the preparation and understanding and asking the questions rather than just telling people what we want to sell them.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I mean, we're going to go on to the pandemic in just a second, but just from and then we'll probably segue into the partnerships piece, but just from a development, to stay there for a second, what are the things that you see as the barriers at the moment to entry in terms of us solving the housing crisis? I mean, it's well documented. We don't need to talk about the really key ones. I know supply chain, etc. But what could get us closer to this 300,000 number that I keep hearing? And I mean, we're nowhere near it, are we? We're really not anywhere near it.
So I think there's no one silver bullet, and I think that therein lies the problem. I think if there was one thing you could go and do, we'd have done it. If you look at the basis of the current housing market, from an affordable perspective, mm-hmm. it's largely based on traditional developers buying land, and you build on the basis of what you can sell. And on a pace of which we still build in brick and block. The majority of our homes are still built in that way. And until that changes, where you can build at pace and at volume, where the absorption rate isn't the defining factor at how quickly you can get things done. If someone gave us 50 homes tomorrow, my housing team probably wouldn't be very keen on it, but the reality is we could probably fill them pretty quickly. Right. So there is demand there, but the current supply chain doesn't fit with that. And I think it's interesting to look at some of the disruptors coming into the market, and clearly around MMC is not particularly it's not a new product, but people are trying to bring that back to the market and create pace. That might shape it. For me, though, I'm looking further down the line. I'm interested in who's the Uber, who's the Airbnb, who's the Amazon of our sector that don't come with a legacy. Because if you were designing a housing association or a development partner, you wouldn't do it anyway, the way we've got it at the moment. You do something fundamentally different. So I think that's going to be we don't know what's going to deliver 300,000 homes is, but I'm sure it will happen because someone will come up with a great idea that will change it.
Of course they will. And at the moment, I'm a big believer of MMC. I think everyone knows that, but I don't think it's the silver bullet. I think it's another strand of a problem-solving mechanism. I think traditional will still have a place. I think MMC will still have a place. I agree with you. Someone much brighter than me will come in with a technology product or something where we can do this much quicker. And I've yet to see it. What's your experience with MMCB? I always like to ask people, but what's your experience so far been with MMC and modular construction, etc.? Because like you're saying, in some countries, in Japan, for example, I mean, it's probably one of the mainstreams of how they produce houses, but they produce millions of houses in that area of the world. Not quite taken off the same way here, but it feels like there's some companies coming through now that might change that a little bit.
Yeah, I think limited experience, if I'm honest with you, and if you look at, even with, you look at, Ilka, for example, only today you look at, they've put a massive investment with Homes England support behind it, and yet they only delivered, 200 homes last year. Yeah. So it just shows, and they're a key player in the sector. And you kind of think, well, if that's the volume that they're doing, it's no surprise that none of us have got real experience.
Absolutely.
What we need to do is create a pace around that so that actually it becomes more acceptable to the sector, and it complements what we're already doing, not doesn't take away from the traditional. I always think that there's absolutely a need for doing that, but we've got to find ways in which people will find that method more acceptable. We de-risk it, and I know there's lots of that going on, but it's just not moving at the pace. And
it's not. It's not,
and it comes with some challenges.
Yeah, it comes with some challenge, and it's not because, is it manufacturing? Is it construction? Is it housing? Like, there's a real quasi of those three things going on, and actually, you still need labour, you still need materials, you still need land, there's still a lot of challenge within that world. So there's other things for us to fix. One thing we've talked about a lot offline is around the pandemic. What's been the impact for futures from a pandemic perspective as a starter, I suppose?
Much the same as anybody. I think there was a bit about two things actually that I think came out at the start, which was we really reconnected with our customers. And I don't want to think that we weren't connected with it, but I think that immediate response of the phone calls, the connection that says, are you okay? What can we do? I think our customers really valued that, and yeah. I think my colleagues valued that insofar as they were able to get to grips with, they weren't looking at administration or spreadsheets. They were just, what, it's the customers. And I would suggest that most people in our sector do this to deliver a really excellent service for our customers. So to be able to connect with them directly was really great. Yeah. And I think the other thing was, and I found this across a number of sectors, it was people didn't hide behind bureaucracy anymore. We just got stuff done because it was the right thing to do. And I was involved in a lot of the tactical responses to the pandemic, working with the local authorities in my previous role when this started. Not so much, and then then kind of moving into futures. But what I found was that people were just finding ways to do things rather than coming up with reasons not to. And I really hope we don't go back to that when we, and I understand we can't all move at the same pace, but we don't want to lose that, because sometimes that pace of change is what's really needed.
Yeah, and you've got to say, and I might be biased, and I've said this before, but the housing sector really stood up and was counted, weren't they, in the time they were needed for their customers, because people put themselves at risk personally, offered care facilities for those that offer care. And I agree. I think we lost a bit of red tape for a period where we actually just did what we needed to do to get by and to make things happen for people when they needed it. And, we fixed the homelessness crisis for a short period of time in that crisis, because hotels opened the doors to the homeless. And it just shows that with a little bit of collaboration as a country, we can fix these things. Sometimes, like you say, we find the reason not to, don't we, more often than not?
I think at the moment, if you take the public sector, and you talked earlier on about the kind of breadth and the depth of some of the challenges that people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but being able to get people round a table and to solve problems, in the moment, and housing is actually quite a difficult sector to engage with. There's so many housing associations and other people providing homes, but getting around the table, working collaboratively, removing which tattoo you had as to which organisation that you were part of on that time, to solve the problems, which is why everybody in was such a success. The problems is that off the back of everybody in, you need to be able to create that more systemic approach to a long term, and that's not always as easy, but it just shows what the art of the possible is when people come together and truly have a singular goal in mind.
Totally agree. And how did you find, remote working in that period, and how's that transition now? Because, us as an organisation, we've done quite a bit of stuff with this, and we've ended up in a hybrid model. But what's been the future's way? What's been your views? How's it worked? What's been the situation with office flexible working, really?
We had a really interesting journey. I mean, not least the fact that I joined Futures during the pandemic. So, kind of 5 stages of interview, only one of which was face-to-face. The rest were virtual.
Right. Wow.
And I'm probably letting a few secrets out now, but, certainly 3 of my interviews, it was during the summer. I had shorts on, but a nice shirt and
yeah, so someone's going to go back to your interview notes now.
To check what you're wearing. Yeah. But again, who'd have thought that you could join an organisation and have an effective interviews through that? So that was a great introduction. Futures was great insofar as they were pretty much ready to go. Everyone was on laptops. We were all agile. We were cloud-based. And so the minute that you had to send up everybody home, including our call center, that was possible. So we pretty much switched overnight. So from a technology perspective, we were well situated. From a response perspective, our organization is very, we've got the kind of an executive level and then our co-exec. And our co-exec created a tactical team, and they pretty much run it on a day-to-day basis, and were really agile in responding. So, I think that was a really strong response to the pandemic. In terms of hybrid working, we've gradually kind of migrated back to the office. We had a situation, however, where the back end of last year, we moved from our old offices based in Ripley, and we created a series of touchdown points, which have all been refurbished across our large patch.
Right. Okay.
And we've relocated to a brand new office space in East Midlands Airport. With that, though, we've had a real opportunity to recreate what that space looks like. And whereas perhaps 5 years ago, we'd have been lines of desks so that people can go in at 9 and go home at 5. There's very few desks in actual fact. What we've created is a collaborative, creative hub. It's a fabulous building to be in. Some really wacky kind of design aspects that keep you interested, but really help you go and work with others. And so we've got a variety of different collaborative spaces. Chairs that I'm not quite sure. I'm probably a bit old to be able to sit on, because you can sit on them like a horse and all sorts of bits and pieces. Use of technology. So we had a great opportunity to shape our office landscape to a way that really fits the hybrid working.
Yeah.
But I think most people have found that really refreshing.
Yeah.
We've allowed our staff to shape what that looks like for them, and describe what work looks like for them going forward, and what time in the office works and what time they need to be at home. And that varies from individual. I mean, that's the one thing I have found. There's no one singular answer for a group of people.
I think you're spot on, and I think everyone was trying to prescribe what it was going to be. And when they didn't know what was happening, it was like, right, you're going to do 1 day in the office, me included, 1 day in the office, 4 days at home. And actually what's actually transpired for us as a business, I'm sure it's the same for most business, I hope it is anyway, is that pick where you want to work from. And, in some cases, I've got people that work in the office full time that worked for their circumstances, but I've also got people that work from home full time. So it's pick your environment you want. And I found it quite difficult, and I'm not going to lie, with culture, in terms of some people feeling a little bit more isolated, some people feeling, and how have you worked with that, and what have you found the positive and negative implications from a pandemic perspective for you, your team, Futures organisation generally?
So I think first thing you have to come across, that you have to get to grips with, and I've done this in my previous role, and fortunately we moved to Agile in my previous role. So
right.
It's about trust. Okay. Having looked after, you and I come from a similar background in some respects, having looked after repairs and maintenance, and you're sitting in on the tracker wondering why the guys are,
yeah.
You think, well, hang on a minute, would I do that to myself? Would I monitor myself in the same way? Do I have trust in the fact that actually I'm at my desk between, every minute of every day? No, I'm not. But do I get my job done? Yes. So therefore you start from a period of trust, regardless of where people are, trust that they'll do the job, and that 99% of the people in your organization come to work to do a good job. So start from that position first. And then I think for me, it's the softer stuff. I'll be honest, in my last role, I would have been in the office every day of the week because I liked that people interaction. I've got used to working at home. I quite like some of that. But I'll be honest, I think most people in my team, and I think I've gone through waves of where my mental health has suffered from being at home and isolated and not with others. Yeah. And you don't connect in the same way. I think that I did a good job initially of connecting with people in the organization, but I think we're as humans, we interact. We're not comfortable in isolation.
Yeah.
So we need to get back into the office and find that energy and that creativity. And I've certainly found that finding the balance between those two things is what's kept me less of the lows and more of the highs during that period.
Yeah, I agree. Couldn't agree more, actually. And one thing that I found is it's a different leadership role, or it has been for me, to lead a team remotely than it is to lead a team when they're in front of you. So I've had to learn a load of lessons on how that works, because you've got to be more regular with your check-ins and your calls, and it's a different role. It is a different role, and it's not going to change.
Set the tone as well. One of the things that as an organization moving into that kind of hybrid, you almost need to give permission. And so one of the things that I was a big advocate of when I joined Futures was we've got like an in-house Facebook type stuff. And I would regularly go out and do videos of me at lunchtime or at, in the morning or in the afternoon on a walk.
Lovely.
Because, and whatever I was waffling on about was kind of irrelevant, to be perfectly frank. It was, look, I'm one of the senior people in our organization, and it's okay for me to go out and have a walk, therefore, and take some time away from my desk.
Yeah, absolutely.
So therefore, it's okay for you to do the same. And I'll be honest with you, it's something that I think makes me more productive. And in fact, the back end of last year, I stopped doing that. And I realized that, I really needed the break at Christmas to be able to come back and do a bit of reflection, thinking I've missed some of those things. And I think now the pandemic's kind of coming back again to restrict some of the things that we're doing. I'm starting to make sure I reintroduce those things back into the day, so that I am showing others, don't just get back into those habits and the poor things around your mental health and well-being, but also it will help you be more creative and come up with better solutions to your problems.
Yeah, well, and I know you're a huge advocate. We've recruited for the business, and I know you're a huge advocate for well-being in the organisation and for everyone. And I'll agree with that. I think the first half of the year last year, I had a really good half year, and I quickly, and it was so interesting, even if you looked at the traffic going into Manchester every day, it quickly got back into the run of just doing the same things I've always done before. And the Christmas was a good time for me to reflect and decide that I need more balance in my life again. And it's constant reassurance that you need to reflect on that, isn't it, regularly, to make sure you're looking after your well-being, because it's easy to just get back into the routine we've always been in for 10, 15 years.
Well, ironically, I live in Norwich, and our office is in the East Midlands airport, so a nice, a nice little round commute. But and people are like, oh, that's miles away, and it's a couple of hours in the car. But that 2 hours in the car of listening to podcasts, sometimes music, but certainly podcasts for me have been a real thing of personal development and almost a separation from the humdrum of reams of emails, of which where's the value add there? Probably not a huge amount, but that time in the car, that reflection on the key strategic problems that we're trying to face as an organization. Well, and you need to, if we all introduce that into our day in small chunks of that reflection and qualitative time rather than that quantitative element, I suspect we'll come out at the side of the pandemic with a slightly different nuance of how we work, but also slightly stronger and a better solution.
And how have you, because I mean, you've just given us one example with the internal Facebook group, but how have you as a leader encouraged sort of self-care amongst your team, the organisation, people around you? How have you kept people to account of making sure that they're looking after themselves and that they are looking after their well-being?
Talking about it, being really honest about my own vulnerabilities, and letting people and creating an environment where we can talk about that. In some cases, it's almost been a bit prescribed. So whether that's a Friday afternoon quiz or that everyone has to come to, or creating the space to do something other than work, and it might be Zoom related or whatever it happens to be. But we did a thing actually, probably it was last year now, where we created a relay. So I'm a member of a running club, and we used to have a relay event, and because we couldn't run that during the pandemic, we did a virtual relay with loads of running clubs across Norfolk and Suffolk. Right. In fact, we got people across the country. And the idea was, on one day, we had people running from 6 a.m. till 12 at night. I took that into the office space and said, well, tell you what, let's do this in terms of a relay where I'd go out for a walk at lunchtime and I'd pass the baton on by naming somebody in a video to somebody else. And the following day, they'd pick the baton up, they'd go out for a walk, and then they'd nominate people. So it almost became that kind of enforced break that you had to do. And I think sometimes, when you're out in the eye of the storm, you don't always realize it, and you need someone just to help drag you out the other side.
You do, and it's funny. It's so interesting. Like we had a Strava run club and a walk club and all these things on Strava. And if you looked at my Strava activity for the half year last year versus the back end of last year, it'd be totally different. And how do we make sure that we don't return back to what we're used to? Because clearly, I'm all about habits and successful habits, but you do just run back into the same things you've always done. And how do we stop ourselves as an industry, as a country, getting back to just the day-to-day grind of driving to work, getting into the office, not having any time for well-being? How do we stop that? What needs to change for us to stop that happening?
It is about habits, I agree, but there's also about having really good people around you. So, my question to you, James, is you've just highlighted the fact you're not doing it anymore.
Yeah.
What you can do, how did you feel about yourself when you were doing that last year? When your Strava was good, how did you feel?
Yeah, it's interesting. Turned interviewer here, but I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? It's good for you, and you're enjoying it, and it's benefiting you, but you just get back into that opening the laptop in the evenings. I'm trying to encourage my team to not work at all but people do, and it's, how do you stop that? Opening the laptop, doing some emails and getting into that routine of doing that. And I don't know the answer, but there is a benefit to the well-being, and it's happening when you're doing it. You're enjoying it. I
think that's the bit. For me, it's about, you all have to look after each other. I'll be as I say, pretty candid with you. At the back end of last year, I probably wasn't living all of my own kind of rules or whatever it happens to be. Absolutely, for best response. But taking time with the family, and I'm quite reflective. I do take time to constantly reflect on, am I getting the most out as I can out of life? Is it serving me, or am I serving it? Yes. And I think, and I've got some really great people around me that will highlight, you're not quite yourself, Ceri. And then you go and do something, and funny enough, I'm just writing a thought piece at the moment, and we're all bombarded, James. I'm sure when you looked at your Instagram feed on the 1st of January, it was lose weight, get fit, and all those kind of clean your house and become more organized.
Move jobs. This is your year.
Exactly. And the trouble is that creates pressure that tells you you're not good enough, and then you create these unattainable goals. And the piece I'm writing says something along the lines of, imagine if every day was New Year's Day, and rather than doing that reflection of, right, I'm going to do something completely unattainable, what does the reflection say in the morning that says, right, what am I going to achieve today that's going to serve me well? Yes. And that's the bit I've tried to take into the new year, so that I continue with some of the good habits that we all do during June, July, when the weather's good, it's not as cold as it is outside and wet, and just do the right things. But my advice to anyone is surround yourself with good people that will keep an eye out for you too.
Yeah, that's a really, really good bit of advice. And I suppose, how do you, the more of a work situation, but how do you instill that into your management leadership team? Because you are an ambassador of this. I've spoken to you previously. I know you're an ambassador, and it really comes naturally to you, but it doesn't to everyone. So how do you instill that into your management team and make sure they're managing their teams effectively and that they're looking after their teams from a well-being and self-care perspective?
I think for me, it's just through conversation predominantly. There are occasions when I've had to do more proactive intervention, shall we say, where you see someone who's really struggling and not doing that. I'm sure I've threatened people with grievances or being fired if they don't actually start looking after themselves, because actually, on a really serious level,
of course,
I've got a duty of care. And if I believe if you look after yourself, that's the best way to look after the people that work for you as your team. And so I look at my leadership team and say, well, look, what's the advice you're giving everybody else? It doesn't take very often, much time, I should say, for people to recognize that sometimes what they're doing is not what they would advocate for the people that work with them. So I think sometimes it's just a moment of asking the question, and that kind of open coaching style for people to get to their own conclusions of what they need to do and to make the change, and to give them permission and time and space to be able to do that.
Yeah, and one thing I looked at last year when we talk about reflecting, I think we're quite similar in that I love reflecting on days, weeks, months. But the one thing I always reflect on is how productive are you actually being sat at a laptop looking at your screen all day? Because reality is what you're doing, 5 hours of actual work a day, and then the rest of it is flicking around. How do you encourage and empower your teams to be effective from home? So the remote working piece again, but how do you enable them to be as effective and productive as possible in the day?
I'm probably not the right person to ask in terms of how they organise their day.
Yeah,
I'm all over the place, but because I quite like lots of variety. Other people like their isolation. I think for me, it's about I encourage them to create structure. I think if you let the day happen to you, or you let the week happen to you, or you let the month happen to you, it will consume you. But I ask people say, well, I haven't got enough time. So create time. And that often is, if you look at your diary, I suppose, in a morning, and you can see that you've got Teams or Zoom calls from 8 in the morning till 5 at night, you're already on the back burner. You're not going to be effective or productive at any of those. But where is your time to prepare for those meetings? Where is your time to create? Where is your time for yourself? And unless you plan, in my view, that will never happen. It will always be ahead of you. So I encourage people to do that and define what works for them.
It's a great answer, that. And it's the same with the gym, right? If I miss Monday, or I miss going for a run on Monday, The likelihood is I'm missing Tuesday and I'm missing, you're setting yourself up for the week in the right way. And actually the rest sort of follows and flows through, doesn't it? I would say.
Well, take running, with work, and I run quite a bit. And and I did the London Marathon last year.
Did you?
And some of those runs are pretty long, and trying to fit them all in. But one of the things I found would make a difference is if I get my running kit or my gym kit out the night before and it was ready to go, I was less likely to make the excuse of going.
Right.
Because I knew I was going and I was ready to go. But if I couldn't make my mind up about what I was doing and when I was going to do it, and I didn't prep for it, it was less likely that was going to be, either I'd get out or that it'd be a quality session. So planning for me is absolutely key for everything that you do, and you're more likely to do it.
Well, and it's interesting because you said you've struggled from time to time, and I'm sure you won't mind me talking about this, about your mental health last year in terms of being at home and had to manage that. But if you're doing marathons, you must have cultivated quite a lot of resilience from a mindset perspective. How have you cultivated that over the years? I'm always interested about this when I hear people doing marathons and long distance running and stuff. How have you cultivated such a good, resilient mindset over the years, would you say?
I don't actually think I've got, I wouldn't say I have a really resilient mindset. What I've recognized is that actually I've got inherent weakness at times in
right.
But what I do is I have those people around me. So for my running, I've got a coach. So when I start going off track, I've got a coach that tells me you need to do this, because you can see that in the same way with work. I think lots of people have coaches for specific times in their life. I personally think having one on a regular basis to sharpen the sword. It's amazing if when you're having a coaching, let's say a series of coaching over a number of months, how everything works pretty well. And the minute you stop the coaching, it all just stops and everything gets a little bit worse. And I do think it's about repetition and being sustainable about all of these things, and keeping you on that straight and now. I'm recognizing that you can't possibly have, it's like, a diet. You're not going to have the willpower not to eat the biscuits all the time. So sometimes you need someone to say, Ceri, put the lid back on the biscuit barrel. And that's kind of where
I wish someone had said that to me over Christmas this year.
Me both. So again, it's about having good people around you, is my view, and recognizing when the resilience is perhaps not as good as it could be.
Yeah. Have you been listening to that? Have you listened to the High Performance podcast at all?
At the moment, I'm listening to two things. One is the High Performance podcast. In fact, three. The other one is Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, which is about workplace culture.
Oh, I've not seen that.
A really good one, actually.
Writing that down.
And the other one actually is the Midpoint, because unfortunately I'm of a certain age, and it's Gabby Logan, and it's talking about kind of people in the midlife, and it started in a position of kind of wanting to get some understanding of what was going on in my wife and I's kind of life. And it's been a real eye opener, actually. In terms, but they've also got loads of sports and various people on there. But they're really good ones. But I love Jake Humphrey. Yeah,
when you listen to the High Performance podcast, the one thing always comes out when you listen to any sportsman on the High Performance podcast, like you just said, is discipline and a little bit of consistency. And actually, there's got to be some flex in that, but actually, just discipline and consistency, and that's where people get to peak performance, don't they? Really, it really is like a common theme on the podcast, I find.
The other thing you'll notice with all those people, I find, is that what they are doing is they have internal validation for their worth and they calibrate externally. Whereas I think with the way social media and things are at the moment, we're constantly looking for that external validation. And we wonder why I think that really impacts on our resilience. So we've got to focus much more internally rather than looking at it, is my view.
Yeah, I agree. And moving away from Wellbeing, we said we'd just touch on some of the partnership stuff, but how have you continued? You mentioned it at the beginning, but just to go into it a bit more detail, how have you continued to build those really strong relationships with partners in the new world, let's call it? I mean, it's not a new world, but like in the new digital world and Zoom and etc. How have you found a way of making sure that you can build the same level of relationship?
It's been really difficult, if I'm being honest. When I left Norfolk, I left a massive network of people that I'd created. And what I found there was I was almost a pivotal part in those relationships in the digital arrangement because I'd done it in the physical world.
Yeah. Okay.
Trying to do that now in the more digital has been been really difficult, especially with a number of our partners who are going through their own challenges. And so you think, lots of organizations became fairly insular looking.
Yeah.
And didn't want to work with, they didn't have the capacity at that point or the focus to be able to look externally. So we've started to try and recreate those relationships with people. What's fortunate is I think that most people are really keen to talk to someone other than their wife, their kids, or the other 3 people they have a Teams call each day with. So there is an openness to want to do some of that stuff. But the hope is that during this year, we can start getting back to a bit more face-to-face. But I think we were hoping that was going to be the case for January, February, but the reality of the situation, not so.
And I've spent enough time in service stations meeting candidates as part of my role to know that Zoom has really facilitated some effectiveness in my day. I mean, I used to drive out to service stations an hour there, an hour back for one meeting, which is just not the way it should be. However, I do miss face-to-face, and I have missed face-to-face for a long time now. So I do think it'll be good to get a balance, and I do think we'll never go fully off Zoom. I think we'll never ever replace face-to-face meetings and building relationships. But what sort of things do you look for in a partner? What's the criteria you would look for a partner at Futures?
Well, the simple thing is that it's something where a mutual relationship can benefit both parties.
Yeah.
Because that's partnership is really interesting in that both parties need to be able to get something from it, and not just a case of here I've got something to offer. That's more contractual. So I think when you understand that first and foremost. Secondly, authenticity, transparency, openness, honesty, a willingness to say this is my position. And this is why, and to give people a view of why you're making the decisions. I've had a number of, we've got something going on at work this week where it was quite clear to me that we were in conflict because we'd never really described why we were doing and saying what we were saying. And it was only when we said, look, this is why we're behaving this way, that the partner came back and said, why didn't you say, we can just, if we just did this, does this solve your problem? You're like, oh, it's really simple. And so of
course,
it's back to basics, talking, being collaborative, and admitting when you being prepared to say we've got something wrong here. I think is also a big thing, because partnerships don't always go that smoothly.
Of course they don't. And as we sort of wrap up, last couple of things was just what do you see as the future for Futures, and also, what's the future of your journey? Have you got anything in the diary for your well-being? As you said, have you got another marathon? Have you got any events coming up? What's the future look like for both?
So Futures is really exciting. We've got some big, I like to look at them as opportunities. I think the sustainability agenda and doing that really well to make sure that we can improve our assets and how our customers live in our assets whilst not impacting on the affordability of living in the homes is a big challenge. I think the white paper and how we engage with our customers and truly get them involved in the decision making and how we shape our service, again, I think which is really a great opportunity for us to reframe how we do those sort of bits and pieces. So I think that along the lines of trying to deliver more and more homes as well. So that's really exciting and really building on the really strong culture at Futures. Yeah. Having said that, we'll never do another marathon. My wife and I waited 2 days before we signed up to the ballot for this year. So potentially another marathon this year. We raised nearly £6,000 between us last year. We're hoping to get into the ballot because that's a big ask to try and do something like that again. But
amazing, yeah. And who did you raise that for? Who was the charity?
It's NF1, so it's neurofibromatosis. Our family's been quite deeply affected by it. My wife lost her brother at the age of 40. So the fact that we were able to go on an extended journey of running, because it started with supposed to be doing the marathon the year before, but we ended up raising a big amount of money and really trying to raise awareness with that that condition, of which most people don't know about, but it's more prevalent than cystic fibrosis, for example.
Yeah, well, amazing achievement and a lovely way to finish. I mean, have you done any marathons overseas, or would you ever look at something like that?
Well, London was the first. We did the virtual marathon the year before, but London was the first marathon that we've done. So nothing overseas. With my complexion, I mean, I know you can't tell it, but I am actually a ginger, would you believe? So anything too warm is probably not a good thing.
Maybe not Brazil.
No, and my wife didn't really enjoy Iceland, so I suspect we need to find some temperate climate.
Yeah, but, fine. Okay.
If we don't get into London, I think Amsterdam's probably on the cards for October this year.
Lovely. I think it's a nice way to end it. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I think it's been great to get an insight into you, but the first time we've really gone deep into the wellbeing piece. And I think it's really nice for people to hear even someone like yourself who's very active. And I know that you run a lot of miles and stuff, but actually people can still suffer with their mental health, even when they do a lot of running stuff. But I really appreciate it. If people want to follow you on LinkedIn, are they okay to do that? If they've listened to the show and want to reach out to you and ask you any questions?
Oh, absolutely. I'm really keen to get involved with people, because as much as anything else, they might be able to help me out as well.
Yeah, well, they can also read your quarterly blog that I read the other week. So I think, if you do want to reach out to Ceri, he's on LinkedIn, and I'll put the link in the notes. But thank you for coming on the podcast, Ceri. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you, James. Really enjoyed the chat. It's great to see you again.
Cheers. Take care.